Good evening and welcome. And welcome to Missoula to you, Jenny. I hope you've enjoyed your day with us. The First World War is sometimes referred to as the Chemist's War because of the impact chemistry had on its course. For example, the chemists Fritz Haber and Karl Bosch succeeded in the manufacture of nitrate explosives from coal and air, and Haber and Otto Hahn introduced battlefield use of poison gases. The Second World War is similarly sometimes referred to as the Physicists' War because of the impact technologies developed by physicists working in the areas of nuclear physics and electronics had on its course. Most of this work in the United States was led by the National Defense Research Committee, founded in June 1940. The original members of NDRC were Vannevar Bush, Arthur Compton, James Conant, Frank Jewett, Alfred Loomis, and Richard Tolman. Bush, Compton, Jewett, and Tolman were well-known physicists and engineers. James Conant was an organic chemist, best known as a dynamic educator, administrator, and president of Harvard University, 1933 to 53. He was chair of NDRC, 1941 to 46, and was also our speaker's grandfather. However, Alfred Loomis, the final NDRC member, has been a shadowy figure, usually referred to in histories of the era only as an immensely wealthy financier. He appeared to come from nowhere to NDRC. It was only when Jennet Conant published her best-selling book, Tuxedo Park, that most people learned of where he came from and the astonishing things he did. Jenny's interest in NDRC and World War II military technology springs not only from her grandfather's role in it, but perhaps even more so from her personal interest and curiosity in her father's favorite uncle, William T. Richards. Richards was the brilliant chemist's son of Theodore W. Richards, a Harvard University chemistry professor and the first American-born Nobel Prize winner. William Richards died tragically in 1940 under circumstances whose complete details were hidden by his family, some even from Jenny's father, Theodore Richards Conant. Jenny applied her skills as a professional journalist to learn more of her great-uncle and the circumstances surrounding his death. Her work led to Alfred Loomis, and finally to the remarkable story she will tell us tonight under the title Technology and the Winning of World War II. We thank President Dennison for his support of this event as part of the President's lecture series, and a contribution was also made by the Richard E. Jude Chemistry Endowment.
I'm honored for the opportunity to address you this evening as part of the Presidential Lecture Series here at the University of Montana. And I'd like to thank Dick Field for his kind introduction. I'd like to thank him for not referring to my book as a memoir, as so many people have in the past. While my grandfather did play a leading role in the scientific and the technological developments of World War II, I promise you I wasn't there for any of them. And I get upset sometimes when people refer to it as a memoir. Before launching into the talk proper, there's something I want to mention. So I'm going to quote Groucho Marx to the effect that before I begin talking, I have something to say. And that is that I'm not a physicist, not even a chemist, not an engineer, and not a science historian, but a complete interloper into this world. I'm a journalist. But then I like to think that it took an outsider to notice someone who both scientists and academic scholars had completely overlooked, a figure so forgotten by history that he hardly appears as more than a footnote in most books about the early days of radar and the nuclear bomb. I think I can demonstrate, however, that it had not been for a man named Alfred Lee Loomis, who most people have never heard of, this country would have entered World War II in far worse shape than it already did, and that in fact, the Manhattan Project would certainly have gotten off to a far rockier start. That would have meant both a delay in the development of radar and the bomb, a delay possibly of many months, which would have meant that the fighting in Europe would have dragged on much longer and at the cost of countless lives. The other thing to keep in mind when listening to the somewhat remarkable story of Alfred Loomis is that I think his role in the war tells also the important and often ignored story of how science, and by that I mean pure science, the research that at that point in time was taking place almost entirely in university settings, how science found its way out of the laboratory and into the world, and in this case, onto the battlefield. One of the lessons of World War II is that when it came to applied science, the practical application of scientific developments and technology into devices for defense and new weapons of war, America truly excelled. Most of the scientific breakthroughs, the actual technological advances of World War II, were pioneered in Europe. By that I'm referring to not only radar, but the discovery of uranium fission by the Germans in 1938, the proximity fuse. So many of the major wartime developments came with the refugee scientists that fled fascism and Hitler and streamed into the United States, and Europe's loss was our gain. But I believe it was the unique combination of American money, organization, and that certain kind of entrepreneurial know-how that found its way to exploit these innovations to their full advantage, first for their military potential, and later for their more redeeming social and industrial uses and value. I think in the book, I attempt a short and close-up look at the extraordinary productive time in science and technology when a great many advances in technical advances came to the fore in a very brief period of time, and when those fruits of those developments promised to make a difference in the balance of power in the world. But I'm getting ahead of the story here. I first heard bits and pieces of this story from my grandfather, who was a somewhat grudging source. He didn't particularly like Wall Street financiers, and I think as a parsimonious Yankee, somewhat resented the extraordinarily wealthy Alfred Loomis. But I grew up in Cambridge among many of the famous veterans of the Manhattan Project, and they would get together at holiday times and family dinners and summertime picnics, and they would talk about the old times, and they often took up the traditional debate of what really won the war, radar or the bomb. And always the same name would come up, this name of this Wall Street financier who had a great hand in both. It was all a long time ago, and most of what was said in those days is now a blur. But what I did remember was the way that in my presence they would sort of look aside and lower their voices and mention the name of my great uncle, who was an accomplished chemist at Princeton, by the name of William Richards, and the family scandal which followed his death, and the publication of a novel he had written. The novel was about a group of brilliant physicists who were working in a secret laboratory. I heard many different versions of the stories over the year, and each was more convoluted than the next, usually thanks to a series of gin and tonics. The stories often got more and more fantastic with the telling, and I came to the conclusion over the years that it was one of those family legends. It was probably more fiction than fact. But then one day I stumbled across this novel in my grandfather's bookshelf, and I read it, and I sat down, and I began to wonder if this character in this novel could be the person that I had heard those scientists talking about in somewhat odd tones so many years ago. And then I began to look for Alfred Lee Loomis in the shadows of history and to see if I could document his life. Because I was a journalist by training and taught never to bury the lead, I started my book with a dead body. William Richards was a respected professor of chemistry, and he committed suicide on January 30th, 1940, just weeks before the publication of his first novel. The novel was called Brainwaves and Death. His body was discovered in a bathtub with his wrists slashed, and there was a suicide note which was discovered beside him. My grandfather rushed to the scene and read the note and promptly destroyed it, and its contents were never revealed. Richard's suicide was a great embarrassment to his prominent Boston family, and both families rushed to cover it up. The Boston papers were told that he had taken an overdraft of sleeping medication, and no more was ever said on the matter. If you know Boston families, Yankee families are notoriously buttoned up, and that won't surprise you. That might have been the end of the story rather than the beginning had it not been for his novel. which was published a few months later. Brainwaves and Death was written under the pseudonym Willard Rich, and it garnered respectful reviews, particularly given its unusual setting. It was a sophisticated modern laboratory where a group of leading scientists were conducting groundbreaking experiments to measure the electrical impulses sent out by the brain, and they were using one of the most advanced electroencephalographs then in existence. A note by the author assures the reader that all the science in the book is true. But none of the critics at the time could be aware of the fact that the author was dead, and that he had in fact even foreshadowed his suicide in the text of the book by killing off a young chemist in the story named Bill Roberts, yet another version of his own name. Nor were they aware that the advanced brainwave research described in the book was all real and taking place in a real laboratory, and the book was in fact a thinly veiled account of Richard's experience working in the deluxe scientific laboratory owned by a Wall Street tycoon named Alfred Lee Loomis. Loomis had amassed a large fortune and had set himself up as a patron of the sciences, modeling himself after the great 19th century British baron scientists such as Charles Darwin and Lord Rayleigh. In the 1920s, Loomis, who was a banker by day and an amateur physicist on weekends, bought an enormous stone castle neighboring his home and transformed it into a world-class private laboratory, complete with a large grating spectrograph and many guest rooms. He turned his vast estate into a scientific playground where he was known to invite the great names in European science to come as his guests, all expenses paid. They would receive first-class tickets to come over by the boat, be picked up by his Rolls-Royce, and whisked off to his mansion in the hills. And come they did, particularly in the middle of the Depression, when money was tight and an invitation to his marvelous facility was greatly coveted. Scientists in those days depended heavily on private patrons to fund their research, and throughout the 1930s, Loomis hosted the leading names: Albert Einstein, Niels Bohr, Enrico Fermi, Werner Heisenberg, James Franck, Arthur and Carl Compton, and Ernest Lawrence all came to his private lab, which Einstein dubbed a palace of science. At the time, when the novel was published, none of the scientists who were familiar with Loomis's facility could read the novel and could fail to recognize that the book's main character was in fact based on the autocratic New York financier. And they could not fail to recognize the setting of the novel as his lavish laboratory, tucked away in the gilded suburb of Tuxedo Park, which was 40 miles northwest of New York City, in the rolling green foothills of the Ramapo Mountains. In fact, George Kiszczykowski, who was then head of the Harvard Chemistry Department, remembers opening the book and immediately recognizing the laboratory from the novel's description. I read to you now from an opening paragraph in the novel. The Howard M. Ward Laboratory, and that was the pseudonym used in the book for Alfred Loomis, was not one of those hospital-like institutions where pure science is hounded grimly and humorously as if it were a venomous reptile. The grounds of the laboratory included a tennis court and bridle paths and a 9-hole golf course. Guests there did not have to confine themselves to science. They could live fully and graciously. I think that George Kiszczykowski had no doubt in his mind that there were not two such institutions in the United States. At the time, both Richards and Kiszczykowski had been young assistant professors at Princeton, and back in the early 1930s, they had spent several summers at Loomis's laboratory where they had been invited to do research and had been given generous stipends. They were also invited to enjoy the laboratory's other amenities, which included sailing, tennis, swimming, elegant drinks parties, and black tie balls, frequented by the most powerful figures in American and European politics and banking. Kiszczykowski particularly appreciated the superb meals served in the ornate oak-paneled dining room, which were served on real silver and presided over by liveried servants, and Loomis's butler, who claimed to be a younger son of the Duke of Northumberland. For a refugee scientist from Russia, it was an extraordinary experience. At the time of his suicide, Richards was also still working for Loomis's laboratory as a part-time chemical consultant. Kiszczykowski, in 1940, was also working for Loomis, only now in a project that was so secret and of such national importance that he was quite distressed by his friend's Romana Clef. he considered a mischievous and reckless act on the eve of the war. By the spring of 1940, Kiszczykowski knew that Loomis was deeply involved in secret war work, and that both he and James Conant were concerned enough about the novel to try to keep it from being published. In fact, they were too late, and the volumes had already shipped to the bookstores. It was rumored that Loomis attempted to buy up every copy in New York City to protect his secret laboratory and his government work. Just as importantly, friends say that he wanted to prevent society in New York from learning of his clandestine affair with a colleague's young wife, who was immediately recognizable from her description in the book as a shapely blonde in a short tennis skirt. While they were too late to stop the publication of the novel, Loomis and James B. Conant did prevent a short story by Richards from ever seeing the light of day. That short story was called The Uranium Bomb, and was again based on the real physicists and conversations about uranium fission research that he had overheard while working at Loomis's facility. The short story's main character was based on Leo Szilard, the temperamental Hungarian refugee scientist who was then experimenting with uranium fission with the Italian physicist Enrico Fermi at Columbia. Szilard was convinced that the Nazis were trying to build a bomb and that would be so powerful it would, quote, blow the end off Manhattan Island, as the character in Richard's story warns, and as Szilard, in fact, was saying in words almost identical in drawing rooms around New York as he feverishly lobbied politicians and financiers in New York to fund his research. But Szilard at the time was viewed as something of a crackpot and a paranoid, and he was largely dismissed. In fact, however, Szilard was in regular correspondence with Richards, and throughout this period. During the summer of 1939, he and Enrico Fermi had worked out the basis for the first successful chain reaction, and he was desperately searching for financial help to underwrite the cost of further fission experiments. But there were no government funds available, and Szilard became frustrated at his inability to enlist private funding from Richards, who had private money, and sent him only very small sums. He wanted to reach Loomis, who he had tried in vain to contact. Szilard was terribly afraid that Germany would realize fission's military potential first, and in his desperation, he turned to his old mentor, Albert Einstein. This led on August 2nd of 1939 to Leo Szilard's drafting what is now the famous Einstein letter to President Franklin Roosevelt, warning him that, quote, an extremely powerful bomb of a new type was now feasible. Just as an aside, it was interesting for me to notice in the correspondence between Leo Szilard and Loomis in the 1950s that he wrote of his frustration at not being able to reach Loomis and told him that summer in 1939 that he thought he was, quote, inclined sometimes to think that much subsequent trouble could have been avoided if contact with you had been established at that time. I think perhaps, though, that Szilard gives himself too much credit because at the time Alfred Loomis was already collecting scientists. He was funding Fermi and helping him obtain government funds for his research and his plans to build a nuclear chain reactor. He was also giving money to Kiszczykowski, and he was soon be heavily backing Ernest Lawrence. But I'll get to him in a moment. As you can see from these events, by 1940, Loomis was rather in the thick of things. War had overtaken Europe, and there was speculation about how long England would be able to fend off the Germans. Roosevelt, however, and the country were resolutely isolationist. Loomis, Conant, and many of the leading scientists of the day who had colleagues in Europe, had studied in Europe, and were far more familiar with the situation, I think, than most of our men in Congress, were increasingly alarmed that the United States was both militarily and technologically unprepared for war, a war that men like Loomis felt was inevitable. Because of his relationship with refugee scientists like Kiszczykowski and Fermi and Niels Bohr, and his extensive contacts abroad, Loomis was singularly well informed about the advances in German science and their interest in the explosive power of uranium fission. In fact, Loomis was privately paying Kiszczykowski to make a study of the matter, and Kiszczykowski would later report there was evidence that a German bomb program was underway, news Loomis would pass on to the White House. As it happened, Fermi and Bohr were guests at Loomis's Tuxedo Park mansion in January of 1939 when Bohr received the telegram from Lisa Meitner, a close associate of Otto Hahn's in Germany, reporting that their own experiments confirmed Hahn's discovery of uranium fission and the enormous energy released. Fermi, Bohr, and Loomis spent the whole of that day and the next discussing the implications of fission, and if enough neutrons were emitted in the fission process, the possibilities of sustaining a chain reaction and a bomb. After that weekend, Bohr and Fermi traveled to the 5th Conference of Theoretical Physics in Washington, D.C., where they immediately let the cat out of the bag. It's funny because General Groves would later complain that you could never trust a physicist to keep a secret, and I'm not sure he was wrong. In the days that followed, physicists here and in Europe rushed to their laboratories to test the process of uranium fission, and within 48 hours it had been replicated here at Lawrence's radiation lab, at Johns Hopkins, and elsewhere. All that summer, there was intense activity in the field of physics and concern about the possibility of creating a fission bomb of enormous power. As a direct result of Einstein's letter to Roosevelt, in the fall of 1939, a uranium committee was formed to conduct classified research on fission explosion. But the wheels of bureaucracy were turning very slowly, and while the committees were being formed and people bickered, not much was getting done. Although the government allocated $6,000 for uranium research, it was a very meager grant, and very little was happening. Concerned scientists like Conant and Bush were arguing the government should take more action. Bush, in particular, was a tough-minded Yankee engineer, and he had recently stepped down as president of MIT to become head of the powerful philanthropy, the Carnegie Institution in Washington, D.C. He wanted to be closer to Washington to have a hand in national policy. He was serving as science advisor to the president, and he was lobbying Roosevelt to mobilize the country's scientists for war. But when it came to Congress and allocating government money, Roosevelt felt his hands were tied. He wanted to win re-election. What most people today tend to forget was that even as late as 1940, as the war ravaged Europe, only 2.5% of Americans thought we should become involved in what was then called the European conflict. As a result, in those uncertain days, as Europe slipped deeper into the war, scientists were forced to look elsewhere for help to jumpstart any kind of preparedness program. Time was of the essence, and Loomis appeared as a towering figure. He was one of the 10 richest men in the country, with close ties to the worlds of finance, industry, and science. Loomis had unparalleled contacts in government through his first cousin, Henry Stimson, who had been Secretary of War and Secretary of State in 2 previous administrations and was rumored to be Roosevelt's choice for the next Secretary of War. Loomis was, in Bush's view, the ultimate insider, uniquely positioned to play a pivotal role as the country took its first steps in preparing for war. The Nazis' formidable blitzkrieg had already demonstrated to the world that it would be, as Bush put it, a highly technical struggle. He could think of no one better than the ingenious Loomis, who was not only a tycoon, but an amateur scientist who already had his own laboratory and the unlimited financial resources to underwrite any research project he found promising, whether it was supporting Lawrence's cyclotron project or writing a $5,000 personal check to jumpstart Harvard's first nuclear physics department. So in the summer of 1939, at the government's request, Loomis quietly converted his gentlemanly scientific retreat into a secret defense research laboratory and began leading an investigation into a new secret war-related technology, the microwave radar systems used to detect airplanes. A year later, in June of 1940, when Bush finally convinced Roosevelt to form the National Defense Research Committee to organize and coordinate scientific research for war, he appointed Loomis head of the radar division. But I need for a second to digress to talk about Loomis's relationship with Ernest Lawrence, because it was key to the role he would play in the war. Ernest Lawrence first visited Tuxedo Park in 1936, venturing out there for one of the annual scientific conferences that Loomis held. Scientists came from all over the country to hear papers and the latest Nobel laureate, and Lawrence, though skeptical, joined the crowd. Lawrence was already famous for his invention of the cyclotron, the most famous atom-smashing machine ever built, and was making important use of it in researching radioactive isotopes that were considered possibly important for medically therapeutic processes. Radiophosphorus had shown promise in treating certain kinds of leukemia, and he had all kinds of major backers. Lawrence and Loomis hit it off, and by all accounts became the best of friends by the end of the weekend. Loomis already had a special interest in the field of high-energy physics because he had made his fortune on Wall Street by cornering the securities market on power utilities. So he had been involved in the field of hydroelectric power since its infancy. Southern California Edison was then the world's largest producer of hydroelectric power, and throughout the booming 20s had given Berkeley and Caltech millions of dollars for physics research programs. Loomis's interest had led him to try his own experiments with a small cyclotron that he had built in Tuxedo Park. He immediately agreed with Lawrence's impulse that he needed to enlarge the cyclotron so the field of application could be extended. They both shared the macho credo of cyclotroneering. The bigger the machine, the better. Both men had absolute faith in scientific progress. Lawrence never thought that technology was the problem, only money. And in Loomis, he met his perfect match. If Lawrence was the first great entrepreneurial scientist in America, Loomis was probably the first great entrepreneur who was also a scientist. Loomis had made a fortune betting on new technology, and Lawrence had no trouble convincing him to help in his plans to build a massive cyclotron. As Louis Alvarez observed, the two men perfectly complemented one another and quickly developed the relationship, quote, that had all the earmarks of a perfect marriage. And they would go on together to become one of the war's most formidable teams. With Loomis's active encouragement, Lawrence's cyclotron steadily increased in size and in cost. Before the 60-inch was even completed, he was planning a far bigger machine, a massive cyclotron for nuclear physics, which Rabi, astounded, called the beam to end all beams. The cost of the machine was also ballooning to a prohibitive degree. Lawrence estimated it would cost $500,000, which at that time was an enormous sum. And as usual, when it came to money, Lawrence was way off. It's worth remembering that in the post-Depression 1930s, raising large sums for scientific research was extraordinarily difficult, and Lawrence had to devote much of his time to fundraising and passing the hat. Loomis first visited Lawrence's Berkeley lab in the fall of 1939 on a trip to California that he was supposed to dedicate to radar research. But in fact, he divided his time between investigating new methods of radar that were being conducted with the klystron tube at Stanford and acquainting himself with the physics at the Rad Lab and Lawrence's plans to build an enormous 184-inch cyclotron. Loomis became extremely enthusiastic about the project and dedicated himself to helping raise the money for the 184-inch cyclotron. He set up a private fund for Ernest Lawrence, gave him an allowance for travel and research, and wrote large checks for the project. He also promised that he would become his chief fundraiser to raise the $500,000, which was quickly escalating to $1 million. He made it his personal mission to raise the money. He was extremely adept at corporate politics and tutored Lawrence in how to win friends and neutralize critics. He opened doors to the richest drawing rooms on the East Coast, introducing him to many of the most influential players in science and business and philanthropy. He introduced him to Vannevar Bush in Washington, Carl Compton at MIT, and Frank Jewett, the head of Bell Labs, all of whom helped bring Lawrence's project to the attention of the Rockefeller Foundation, which was then the richest purse in physics. In the meantime, Lawrence won the Nobel Prize, and emboldened by his success, he escalated his plans for the new cyclotron and announced his intention of using a magnet weighing between 4,000 and 5,000 tons in a housing 120 feet in diameter. Instead of $500,000, he would need $750,000. Now, he said, perhaps it might be $2 million. The Rockefeller trustees were so flabbergasted by the price tag that they concluded that Lawrence, as one board member said, had had too much California sunshine, and they rejected his proposal as too risky and too expensive. Loomis immediately rushed in and spent the next few months lobbying furiously on Lawrence's behalf, getting his old friend Compton to write a glowing letter of support, having Conant write letters, and as the deadline approached, Loomis organized a luxurious conference at the Del Monte Lodge in Pebble Beach, and as Bush put it, hired a whole darned hotel and gathered everyone who mattered in science and money. He put on quite a show, and at the end of the weekend, Lawrence had his grant. According to Louis Alvarez, Loomis had been instrumental in securing virtually unanimous support of the scientific establishment to build the atom smasher. No sooner than Rockefeller money was banked than Loomis took Lawrence to Wall Street, where the two men spent several weeks making the rounds, and Loomis made sure that Lawrence got the best deals possible for the iron and copper he needed to build his big machine. Despite the wartime shortages, he got bargain rates. Lawrence later recalled the way Loomis turned to him after negotiating a deal for copper with the Guggenheims and said, "Okay, now we have to go after the iron." He picked up the phone and had his secretary put through a personal call to the chairman of U.S. Steel, Ed Stettinius, who was later Secretary of State and a close friend. As Lawrence recalled listening in, Loomis said, "Hello, Ed, this is Alfred. I have somebody I'd like you to meet." It is impossible to understand how Loomis was able to mobilize so much money and support for the cyclotron project, while at the same time conducting secret research on radar at his mansion in Tuxedo Park, without understanding first what an imposing figure he was in the rarefied world of New York finance and society in the late 1930s. Although his Tuxedo Park laboratory was in the heart of the country's most gilded suburb, Loomis was able to operate covertly there, with little interference from his wealthy neighbors like the Juilliards and the Astors. He had always been something of a loner and a bit of an odd duck, and no doubt they regarded the increased secrecy around his mansion as just another of his eccentricities. By that time, the New York press had already dubbed him the Wizard of Tuxedo Park and reported on his amazing double life as a banker by day and scientist by night, which only added to his air of mystery. None of them apparently took notice of the low-flying planes circling the golf course, or the microwave radar dish mounted discreetly on the back of a diaper truck, and which followed the planes at a small distance. It was actually one of the first radar speed guns ever built, and in a particularly prescient moment, Loomis observed that it would be a tragedy if the police ever got hold of one. In any case, locals witnessed the odd comings and goings and complained about the occasional explosions that rattled China for miles around in the area, but any inquiries were politely but firmly rebuffed. Loomis, after all, was one of the founding members of the posh Tuxedo Park Association and one of the richest and most respected members of the exclusive invitation-only Tuxedo Club. More to the point, in most cases, he was their investment banker and therefore beyond reproach. Loomis was always regarded as a bit of a cipher by his Wall Street peers. He was intensely private and secretive about his past and had about him an impeccable but impenetrable Yankee reserve. In 1930, Fortune magazine wrote, "Anyone meeting him casually for the first time might find it hard to distinguish him from the great mass of men of distinction who are reared in the best families, processed in the best schools, groomed by the best tailors, and put in vice presidential windows of the best firms." But Fortune noted, "The easy and somewhat suspect charm of carefully tendered manners, in his case, it's quickly evident the manners are not the man." As Fortune went on to say, few Wall Street financiers of his generation could match Loomis's extraordinary intellect and sheer versatility. He had been a child prodigy in chess and could play blindfold by the age of 9. He could carry on 2 games of mental chess simultaneously by age 13. He had always had an inventive bent and had built elaborate model airplanes and electric cars as a boy, but he never pursued science as a career. In large part, this was because his father and grandfather, who were both prominent doctors, his father died when he was a young man, and his father had been something of a bounder and a cad, and has left his mother and his sister with a very nice last name and no money. He was under enormous pressure to support his mother and sister, and he was somewhat bitter about society's treatment of his mother and sister when his father left them. In addition, his first cousin, Henry Stimson, became something of a father figure. Henry Stimson became his mentor and was 20 years his senior. He was at the time regarded almost as the American Churchill. He was one of the most esteemed American statesmen and had served as Secretary of War under Taft. Henry Stimson firmly believed that all proper gentlemen proceeded first to Andover, then to Yale, and then to Harvard Law School, and it was an unshakable belief, and Loomis did exactly as he asked, though I think his heart was never in it. After graduating, Loomis headed quickly onto Wall Street into Stimson's firm and became a star Wall Street banker. I think that he possibly could have had a very conventional life had it not been for the outbreak of World War I. As a lieutenant colonel, he was assigned to the Aberdeen Proving Ground, and almost immediately Loomis's innate mathematical ability came to the fore. He was soon testing the weapons theories of Thomas Edison. In one harebrained scheme, he said he almost killed himself and all of his men. But Loomis's ability quickly made improvements on the Army's antiquated cannons and tank construction, and he invented a revolutionary device known as the Loomis chronograph, later renamed the Aberdeen chronograph, which measured the velocity of shells. He granted the Army the patent on the device, and it was used to measure ballistics for the next 25 years. That gives you something idea about the rate of change in military technology. At Aberdeen, Loomis met Robert Wood of Johns Hopkins. Wood was one of the country's leading experimental physicists, and Wood was a very eccentric and charismatic figure. And Loomis immediately was smitten with him and began doing pioneering work with him in ultraviolet radiation. Wood was also a famous debunker of scientific frauds and scams. He was a fabulous collector of the press. The press wrote about him all the time, and he was to be an enormous influence on Loomis. Loomis hired Wood as his tutor and embarked on a course of private study in physics. He turned his garage of his Tuxedo Park mansion into a small laboratory. Now, Loomis did not have the funds that he needed to do this, so he needed to go to Wall Street and make as much money as fast as possible. He quit his job at the respectable law firm, much to Henry Stimson's dismay, and joined forces with his brother-in-law, Landon Ketchum Thorne, who was an up-and-coming Wall Street broker. He was a fellow Yalie who Loomis had introduced to his sister and would soon become his brother-in-law. Thorne had already made a name for himself on Wall Street as one of the smartest young salesmen around, and he realized at once that Loomis's mathematical genius would give them an edge in the financial game. Together they took over a moribund Wall Street firm called Bond Bright and Company, ousted the Bond Brights, and took over. They went into a relatively new field of power utilities and almost at once emerged as leaders in financing and developing the electrical power industry. Loomis had the foresight to realize that the industrial demand for electricity would grow exponentially over the next decade, and when the boom in the utility market hit, they were perfectly positioned to reap the whirlwind. Between 1924 and 1929, Bond Bright alone did upward of $1.6 billion in financing. To give you an idea, that means that they underwrote more than 15% of all the power bonds in the country. By the end of their phenomenal 9-year run, they had taken Bond Bright from near bankruptcy to becoming a Wall Street legend, and they were lauded corporate capitalists of the first order. Loomis sat on the board of nearly every major bank and railroad in the country. He was on the advisory board of every power company. His advice was sought by European countries hoping to match the development they had seen in the United States and to bolster their economies. In 1928, it's very funny, Mussolini calls him, and he goes to Mussolini to see if he can help them get more power. This was before the war broke out. That must have been quite an adventure. In 1928, just when Wall Street was in the giddy grip of speculation fever, Loomis determined that the market was out of hand and had reached its peak. He began quietly to sell all of his holdings. Then came Black Thursday. On October 24th, 1929, stock prices plummeted, and many wealthy investors lost everything they had. Their entire net worth was wiped out overnight. To give you an idea, his neighbors in Tuxedo Park, the Vanderbilts, lost an estimated $40 million of their railroad holdings in one day, and J.P. Morgan, at least that much, and some people estimate double. But Loomis was sitting on a mountain of cash and long-term government bonds. And like the wily Bernard Baruch, he proceeded to make an estimated $50 million for the first few years of the Depression. Loomis had foiled Black Thursday, and the so-called, quote, scientific approach that he said he used to guide his financial affairs was now gaining almost mythic status. In less than a decade, Loomis had become enormously wealthy and powerful, and he played as hard as he worked. He purchased, in 1930, the first America's Cup yacht. At that time, America's Cup yachts were only owned by sort of dynastic families like the Astors. It was prohibitive for a private individual to have one. He lavished a fortune on it and came in dead last. The boat was said to boast all kinds of special devices, and it did him no good. At the same time, he privately bought 22,000 acres of Hilton Head Island, virtually the entire island, and turned it into a private hunting and fishing retreat for his family and friends. Loomis was never interested in making money, however, as an end in itself. He had more than he could ever hope to spend. In 1934, at the age of 45, and at the top of his game, Loomis stunned Wall Street by quitting. He withdrew from almost every board he sat on. He retired to Tuxedo Park and announced his intention to take up physics full-time. In 1926, he converted a neighboring mansion into a world-class laboratory where he began conducting experiments in every area of science, from medicine and physiology to astronomy, biology, and physics. Wood moved in and became the laboratory's director. He recommended a private course of study and books to read for Loomis. He took him on 2 separate grand tours of European laboratories, where Loomis bought every conceivable device under the sun. Returning from Europe and inspired by what he had seen, Loomis decided that he would turn his laboratory into a famous institution. He purchased a high-powered vacuum tube oscillator from GE and installed it in his lab, and together with Wood began doing pioneering experiments in high-frequency sound, following in the footsteps of Paul Langevin's high-frequency sound wave research in Paris. He then improved the oscillator, and they built a far more powerful pilotron oscillator, which was actually similar to the high-frequency oscillators then used in radio broadcasting. They stepped up the voltage from 2,000 to 50,000 watts and were able to produce super sound waves with frequencies over 200,000 per second, which was more than 10 times beyond what is audible to the human ear. Walking around in earmuffs for protection, they discovered that super sound waves could be used to churn water, create pulse waves, and applied to the contents of a test tube, it could shake 2 separate chemicals into an emulsion. Loomis and Wood presented their findings to the National Academy of Sciences in Washington in 1926. The work they were doing began to garner the attention of other physicists and was published in scientific journals here and abroad. They went on to experiment with supersonic sound waves, dubbed death rays by the press, on living organisms, killing frogs, fish, and mice all over Tuxedo Park. They observed that the waves had the faculty of breaking down blood vessels and therefore had a deadly effect on small animals and fish eggs and some kinds of plant life. They authored a number of classic papers on physical and biological effects of high-frequency sound waves. And today, he and Wood are listed as the fathers of ultrasonics in many textbooks. Ultrasonics, now known, of course, as ultrasound. Throughout 1930s, Loomis continued his various experiments. He got bored quickly and moved from one area to the next. He conducted experiments in perfect time, buying 3 of the then famous astrological short clocks. The core of Big Ben is a short clock. They were then the most accurate clocks available. They had a free pendulum swinging in a vacuum in an enormous glass cylinder and were said to be accurate to 1/10 of a second in a year. The clocks were so prohibitively expensive that only 5 of the biggest observatories in the world could afford to own one. Loomis had 3. $1,200 each, roughly. They cost $1,200 each, which was roughly a year average worth an average American's annual salary at the time. He installed them in the bedrock of his Tower House laboratory and began to conduct experiments in precise time. Of course, he immediately began making breakthrough after breakthrough because nobody else in the world had 3 clocks and could do those experiments. He clocked the time to the 10,000th of a second. He demonstrated for the first time the moon's effect on ordinary pendulum clocks, a gravitational pull which had long been known but never demonstrated. He was able to achieve such spectacular results and publish major findings in part because of the sheer novelty of the quartz crystal clocks that he purchased and did experiments with at the time. There was no lab in the world that could rival the assembly at Tuxedo Park. At the same time, he began working in another field with John Hubbard of Johns Hopkins. Loomis developed a sonic interferometer to analyze the molecular effects of supersonic waves in liquids. He excelled at building what Kiszczykowski called complex apparatus. Working with E. Newton Harvey, a professor of biology at Princeton, he helped develop the microscope centrifuge, a device which enables scientists to witness for the first time what happened to cells when they were subjected to high gravitational forces. And that led to new discoveries in cell structure. Bored again, in the mid-30s, Loomis immersed himself in the study of brain waves, and together with Hallowell Davis of Harvard Medical School, he did groundbreaking research which led to advances in the use of the electroencephalograph, the EEG, which led, for example, to the early identification of petit mal epilepsy and other disorders, which strangely enough were used to screen troops for World War II. Loomis would receive a patent for this and many other of the devices he would invent. In conferring an honorary degree on Loomis in 1933, Yale cited him as, quote, a lawyer, businessman, physicist, inventor, and philanthropist, adding that in his varied interests and powers of invention and services to his fellow man, that Loomis was, quote, the 20th century Benjamin Franklin. What they did not know then was that he had only just begun. By 1940, Britain was teetering on the brink of despair. Hitler had begun its relentless air attacks on London and other cities as a prelude to invasion. One of England's leading scientists, Sir Henry Tizard, who was the head of the country's air defenses, saw that it was only a matter of time before England was outmatched by Hitler's forces. Tizard recognized that the war had become harnessed to technology, to powerful new weapons, and that the ability to build them first was the key to victory. But England was on its last legs, and it had neither the men nor the resources to spare for such an effort. Convinced that England's only hope was America's assistance, he lobbied Churchill to ask Roosevelt for assistance in developing these decisive new weapons of war. In one of the greatest gambles of World War II, Churchill agreed, and the secret Tizard mission set off on a dangerous journey across the ocean, carrying with it all of England's greatest military scientific secrets: the jet engine, new anti-submarine devices, proximity fuses, the Enigma codes, and most important of all, new advances in microwave radar. All these classified papers, diagrams, blueprints, and models were locked in a small tin solicitor's box and shepherded overseas by Tizard and a hand-picked group of top British physicists and radar experts. John Cockcroft, the renowned British physicist who was among the group, remembers that they drilled holes in the metal box for fear that if they were torpedoed by a German sub, it would stay afloat and fall into the Nazis' hands. The Tizard mission arrived in Washington in September of 1940 and proceeded almost immediately to the famous experimental radar lab run by Alfred Loomis in Tuxedo Park. Loomis was well known to the British, and on behalf of the American government, he had toured their radar labs and installations along the coast. The British had pioneered what was then the most sophisticated radar system known, the chain-home system. And it was the best in existence, but it was long-range radar, and it was a slow and inexact method, requiring ground operators to read the signal and then alert the pilot who was flying virtually blind in the air. And while it helped the British destroy enough of the Luftwaffe planes to stave off Hitler's first attempt at an invasion, they knew it would not be adequate to protect England from another attack. Tizard and his men brought the tin box to Loomis's living room and on a historic night in October unveiled their prize. A small copper disc, a resonant cavity magnetron, is small enough to hold in the palm of your hand. For the British, the cavity magnetron was, as Churchill called it, a pearl beyond price. It was the technological miracle that could change the course of the war. The small device was a source of microwaves that could revolutionize radar. It could power new radar devices with vastly improved range and resolution and turned England's beleaguered Spitfires into deadly night fighters, which could for the first time pick off German planes flying under the cover of fog and clouds and nightfall, and hunt down German submarines that were cresting above the water, hidden by fog and waves. For the British, it was the difference between life and death. If the Americans would join them in the technological battle, they would give America this scientific breakthrough as a dowry in marriage. Loomis, who had been struggling to develop a powerful new microwave radar all along, immediately recognized the potential of the cavity magnetron. The radar sets then used by the U.S. Army and Navy were all long wave, 1 to 2 meters, and needed huge towers and massive reflectors to operate. Loomis realized at once that with the magnetron, small microwave radar systems in the 10-centimeter range could be mounted in a plane and airborne. It would allow pilots for the first time to accurately gauge the enemy's position, distinguish from the number of planes attacking, and find submarines. It amounted to a huge tactical advantage, and Loomis promptly got on the phone to Stimson and the president and reported that this was the device that could bring the war to a swift end. On that same historical fall weekend, after listening to the British outline their pioneering device, Loomis said that he took a shower and had an epiphany. He proposed an idea he had for a completely new kind of long-range radar navigation system, which had come to him during his bath. It became the basis for LORAN, which used a grid of radar beams to fix the location of ships and aircraft, and would later become one of the most important new radar devices of the war. Because of Loomis's close relationship to Henry Stimson, who had great regard for his young cousin's brilliant mind, Loomis was able to persuade the president to help the British scientific effort. Roosevelt gave Loomis the go-ahead to begin the development and production of these powerful new radar devices in a secret new radar lab to be hidden in the heart of Cambridge, Massachusetts on MIT's campus. What better place to hide a bunch of physicists? Even before congressional funds could be voted and allocated, Loomis began pouring in hundreds of thousands of dollars of his own fortune into the secret new lab, getting it off the ground as quickly as possible. That fall, he quietly closed his Tuxedo lab operation. They packed up all the equipment, and they moved to MIT. There was only one man in the country at that time who could help him get a huge secret radar lab up and running virtually overnight, and that was the popular and charismatic Ernest Lawrence. He was as close to a natural-born leader in the field of physics as any scientist could. Lawrence at that time was probably as close to fame in this country as Albert Einstein is still today. He was a recognizable face. He was really the face of American physics. Lawrence, out of loyalty to Loomis, who had funded all of his research for a decade, took time away from his work at Berkeley to act as the principal recruiter and band leader for the new lab. He began by volunteering his best students, Louis Alvarez and Edward McMillan, and a former protege and accomplished physicist in his own right, Lee Dubridge. Lawrence had the same conversation with every physicist of consequence in the country over the next 2 years, crisscrossing the country by train. Many of them were on the brink of major careers in nuclear physics, but they literally hung up their lab coats and came to Cambridge the next day for one simple reason: Ernest Lawrence had asked them to. Lawrence recruited the best and the brightest physicists of the day to work at the MIT Radar Lab, as it was then dubbed, in Lawrence's honor, and because they hoped to mislead the Germans into thinking that nothing important was taking place except a bunch of nuclear physicists at work. Radar was much too important then, and fission was just a dream. In a few short months, Loomis and Lawrence brought together the greatest minds in physics to build these powerful new radar systems. It was more engineering than physics, but it didn't matter since microwave electronics was so new, none of them knew how it worked. II Robbie recalled that when they signed up for technical divisions, it was like choosing up for a baseball team. They just picked sides. But Loomis and Lawrence were confident that the physicists could do anything. They believed that physicists had the intellectual mobility to figure out any kind of science and would get the job done. They threw themselves into the effort to save England and began working night and day on these new, highly experimental radar devices that would eventually be mounted on every Allied plane and sub, and would make the critical difference on land and sea, in air, in every theater of the war. And all of this was a year before the Japanese would show the world just how important radar was. On Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941, the Japanese hit America's naval stronghold in Pearl Harbor. The following day, America declared war on Japan. America's meager radar defenses, which Loomis had argued were inadequate for 18 months now, had failed to protect the country from attack. It had been inadequate to warn of the incoming planes. The feeble transmission they had received had gone ignored. America is now in a war on two fronts, and Loomis, who had been working in radar defenses on his own for a year, was now in a breakneck race against both the Germans and the Japanese for technological superiority. After Pearl Harbor, Loomis's wartime lab would double and quadruple in size, growing exponentially every month to meet the demand for their deadly new tactical radar devices. Loomis's radar lab would become the biggest wartime defense effort, occupying hundreds of buildings in the Boston area, sprawling over 15 acres of office space, and employing more than 4,000 scientists, engineers, technicians, and researchers, 8 of whom would win Nobel Prizes for their work. It had a daily budget of $125,000, or close to $4 million a month. They worked 365 days a year to invent and build the new airborne radar devices. By June of 1943, they had shipped 6,000 radar sets to the front. 22,000 were on order by Allied forces, and production was climbing weekly. It was, in the words of MIT President Carl Compton, the greatest cooperative research establishment in the history of the world. They had started out behind, and they finished ahead. They made history. They smashed the U-boat, which had blockaded all the convoys and was threatening to starve England into submission. They shot down German planes, and they destroyed the V-1 rocket. It was radar that enabled Allied planes to destroy German roads, railways, factories, and supply lines, crippling their forces and bringing the European war to a close. Along the way, they had introduced some revolutionary concepts into warfare and packed decades of radar and weapons research into only a few years. As General George Patton observed in 1945, after witnessing the radar system's help in vanquishing the enemy in the Rhineland, he said, "This is the way that wars not only can, but must be run from now on." Loomis had helped force the development of radar within the Army, and he had lobbied to gain acceptance for the new weapon systems and the tactics, and he had used his considerable fortune and political contacts to mobilize the products of science and technology quickly, helping to speed the day of victory. Loomis was there at the critical moment when America was on the brink of war, and he was urged the scientific establishment, the military, and the president to action. As he himself would later acknowledge, those were the months in which the weeks counted. As Ernest Lawrence noted after the war, quote, "If Alfred Loomis had not existed, radar development would have been greatly retarded at enormous cost in American lives." Working behind the scenes, Loomis also used his influence to speed the progress in uranium research. Lawrence came up with the first feasible proposal to build a bomb, which, as Arthur Compton noted in his memoir, Atomic Quest, really marked the beginning of the American bomb project. After the war, Bush would recall that Lawrence and Loomis together were a 1-2 punch that was too much at times, even for the president. They could get things done, they could move mountains, and they could raise money virtually overnight. The Manhattan Project would never have moved so smoothly, so swiftly. It would never have been oiled by so much cash had it not been for Alfred Loomis. Ironically, in the end, Lawrence's bombs stole radar's thunder. 2 modified forms of the Calytron, which Lawrence first sketched sitting in Loomis's living room, were used in large numbers to produce virtually all the fissionable uranium-235 for the first atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. The Manhattan Project, which was modeled on Loomis's radar lab and borrowed dozens of its best scientists, got all the glory. Time magazine's scheduled cover story on radar was bumped to page 78, and the new cover celebrated Oppenheimer and the Los Alamos physicists. But as Loomis's radar boys would always say, radar won the war, the bomb just ended it. Although the intensely private Loomis attempted to avoid public recognition, he collected virtually every laurel and award possible. Truman granted him in 1945 the Presidential Medal of Merit, the highest civilian award possible. But Loomis shunned all of the various chairs and important positions and Washington policy positions that were offered to him, and he retreated from public life. His self-imposed exile was largely due to a bitter scandal that surrounded his personal life. He had been married for years to a prominent Boston socialite who was something of a depressive. In love with his colleague's young wife, he attempted to have her institutionalized permanently and to run off with his wife. His son came back from a wartime furlough to find that his mother had been institutionalized against her will. He got her out of the hospital, but Loomis had already gone to Nevada and in one day gotten a divorce and the next day married his mistress. New York society was not kind, and he became a virtual pariah. I think stunned and embittered by society's treatment of him and his new wife, who was Belgian and foreign-born with a heavy accent and not kindly received in the drawing rooms of New York society matrons, he decided to turn his back on the world. He retreated to East Hampton, which was at that time really quite remote, and buried himself again in private research. He returned to the life of the lone scientist and rarely ventured to Washington except for occasional meetings of the Atomic Energy Commission, which was one of the few policy boards he still agreed to sit on. He made himself available for consultations, and he was still regarded as a towering figure. Carl Haskins, who was president of the Carnegie Institution, said that scientists and politicians continued to take the trip out to East Hampton to seek his advice because of, quote, his seer-like vision, an insight only given to the greatest of men. Loomis remained best friends with the scientists that he had worked with during the war and continued to fund his research. He died in 1975 at the age of 87. Afterwards, Louis Alvarez called Loomis the last of the gentlemen scientists, the last of the great amateurs, and he lamented that Loomis had been forgotten by history. He noted that it was an anonymity of which Loomis would have been very much approved, but which hardly did him justice. I was writing the end of this book during 9/11, and the events of 9/11 shook New York. When the book came out, I noted with interest that one reviewer said, I think it was the Wall Street Journal, that we could use some modern-day Loomises right about now. And I couldn't have agreed more. I was therefore all the more amused when the review went on to say that a modern-day Loomis might mobilize this country's unique and extraordinarily powerful entrepreneurial engine to thwart another catastrophic terrorist attack, and went on to say the equivalent feat today would be a dot-com billionaire locking himself and a dozen of bright programmers in a Silicon Valley garage to write a new code that would profile and identify would-be terrorists. Last month, I received a phone call from a biotech millionaire in San Francisco that said that he had read Tuxedo Park and was inspired by Loomis's role in World War II. He's currently organizing a conference in San Francisco. He was motivated by one of the major findings of the 9/11 Commission, that U.S. intelligence, quote, lacked imagination in trying to respond to the pre-9/11 terrorist threat. And the panel also singled out the government's inability to act quickly as a major deficiency in dealing with terrorists who are always adapting and increasing their efficiency in their attacks. As a personal endeavor inspired by Loomis, Mark Lampert said that the conference that he hopes to hold in the Bay Area in early 2005 would address some of these deficiencies. Warren Buffett has personally agreed to be the foundation's co-sponsor of the conference. The idea, they say, is to catalyze the formation of one or more independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit teams of highly accomplished entrepreneurs to study and identify specific counterterrorism opportunities, mobilize resources in the private sector, and implement the measures expeditiously. Lampert wrote me a letter that said, inspired by Loomis, the participants will be, quote, creative, intelligent, experienced individuals of means who are motivated by patriotism rather than profit. So I'm happy to report that the legacy of Alfred Lee Loomis lives on.
Jenny would be willing to answer a few questions. Could I ask you to use the microphones located around the room if you would like to ask a question?
Are there any questions?
Thank you, Jenny. That was so very interesting, especially what you shared at the end. Can you talk a little bit more, looking forward to the conference in California? Are they, can you just talk more about that? And in particular, if you know how people can be a part of that from a distance, and whether it addresses the roots of terrorism. I happen to be sitting next to, I just want to say one of the things I also was, and I wondered if you could comment on, is we're talking about hard science in terms of the laboratory work that he was doing, and what we're talking about now is the soft sciences, human perception, imagination, what drives people and what motivates them.
To answer your first question, I think that after 9/11, an awful lot of the Silicon Valley tycoons wanting to do something, they didn't really know how. There was a lot of talk about it. One of the problems that was exposed after 9/11 is, of course, that we have very poor security in this country. People stream into this country and then disappear. We have the government's computers are overtaxed. They're primitive. We have no good system of storing who comes into this country and of tracking them. That's essentially a software problem. And I think that the motivation of this fellow is to try and get some of Silicon Valley's top computer tycoons, their people, and the terrorism experts together to think about a private project that could be done. I guess it would speak to their lack of faith in the government bureaucracy and the government's ability to really solve this problem on their own in a timely fashion. It's not a grassroots thing really, though. I think it's going to be done at a very high level in the Bay Area in early 2005. I think that the call is going out to top programmers, tycoons, and terrorist experts, for those of you in the audience who fit that description. I'm not sure I understood the second half of your question.
I just noticed, and I'm sure you have had people comment, I'm very curious if you had, that his work was cutting edge hard science.
Hard science, yeah.
Versus what we're talking about now is more the soft science. Because I mean, some of it is hard science technology, but we're also talking about the predictability of human behavior.
Well, some of that is because the hard sciences have fallen out of fashion in recent years, which I think is too bad. That was a booming time in hard science, an enormously productive time, and a hugely productive time in physics. So it was natural that that's what he was in. Now there's been more, a lot of people think that has passed and that there's more going on now in the soft sciences, but I think there's no reason that couldn't change again. So any other questions?
Well, to slightly follow up on that, are we not being misled by that experience to think that there is a technological solution to the problem of terrorism?
There's not a technological solution. There's only inadequate and temporary means of protection. It's not a solution to the problem.
I've worked a little bit in journalism and education, and I've been one all my life too. Although I haven't written a great book like you, but I would like to ask you, in your experience, in your education as a journalist, and in your experience before you wrote this book, what were some of the valuable things that you learned, and where did you learn them? Just about investigative reporting, because in a sense your book is a large and very interesting sort of investigative report. I'd just be interested to hear about your background and your education in this area and what inspired you.
It's a funny question. A lot of people said to me when I was on my book tour, what made you think you could write about physics? And I always answered, well, Richard Rhodes, the Pulitzer Prize winning author of The Making of the Atomic Bomb, wrote a sex book before that book, and so that was very inspiring to me. I come to this by a very circuitous route. I was a Greek philosophy major at Haverford. I then my parents thought I would drive a cab as a result, wanted me to go to law school. I did go to law school. I dodged that bullet by immediately enrolling in the joint degree program at Columbia, where you could also get a master's in journalism. I had no interest in journalism. I just didn't want to go to law school. I got my master's first and got hired by Newsweek. Because of my last name, Conant, they immediately decided that I was a science expert, and again with no background, began covering science. Seemed to be my destiny. At the time, Steve Jobs and Bill Gates were young guys coming out with personal computers, and it was the hot science story of the year. They needed technology reporters, and technology reporters really didn't exist much at the time. You had sort of classic environmental reporters and whatnot, but nobody that knew much about computers. And I had grown up in a family of scientists and computers and was at home with scientists, so it became my beat, and I spent the next several years at Newsweek as a science reporter covering technology. So I did get some formal training in it, but really I don't think that's what stood me in such good stead. It really was being a journalist. As you said, being an investigative reporter, you're thrown time and time again into a foreign country, into a foreign, whether it's a billionaire in Australia or whether it's, a nefarious character here on Wall Street, where you have to build a portrait of them, interview their friends and families, find out things about them that they don't want known. You have to read scientific reports and corporate reports, you have to read income tax filings, and you have to be skeptical and not accept the conventional wisdom and try and think for yourself and find stuff that hasn't been reported before. And all of that training year after year gave me a sense of how to tackle somebody as complicated as Alfred Loomis. The science was one part of the story, but by far the most difficult thing about writing about someone who didn't want to be remembered, it didn't leave a record, was just the forensic aspect of finding him in history. He didn't exist in any book. He wasn't in a textbook. He wasn't anywhere. And I had to find his correspondence. I had to find his friends. I had to track down every piece of paper with his name on it to try and build a record of his life. And so it was a real treasure hunt. It took me about 3 years. And there were great weeks of finding things and then months of just despair where I couldn't sort of figure out what he did for years at a time and thought, how is this book's going to come together? So it was a very difficult job. But I think reporting is great training for book writing. The problem, of course, is that we reporters deal with very short deadlines and have short attention spans, and book writing is the opposite. So it's a very jarring transition, but it's very good training. Any other questions?
So, what about the role of journalism in sorting out information as an industry? And if we're to make good decisions, as Loomis did in World War II and the United States did, how can we make good decisions if we can't accurately dispense information to the public?
I think it's a very good question, and it's a timely question. As I said earlier in some conversations with some of your colleagues here, I'm distressed to report that I think this is not journalists' greatest hour. I think you will find, in fact, a great many journalists beating a hasty retreat into historical books because many of us would rather be writing books right now than working for some of the leading publications. It's not a good time in American journalism for a lot of different reasons, commercial pressures and erosions of standards and sloppiness, and there have been some obviously very sad controversies in recent years that have eroded public confidence, and probably rightfully so. I would say that any student of journalism knows that these things are cyclical. We've had far worse journalism, we've had far yellower journalism, we've had far more sensational journalism in the past. I like to think that usually what happens in journalism is that the journalists and the owners grow fat and happy. It's all about profits. They get greedy, they lower standards, journalism gets worse, and usually what happens is the younger generation comes along and comes out with a new publication, a better publication, embarrassingly exposes the excesses of the fat cats before them, whether it's the Hearsts or the Murdochs, perhaps, and the curve somewhat rights itself. So I think we're deep in the pit of excess right now between Fox and Murdoch. I'd like to think that there's a correction coming soon. Hope I live to see it. Happy I'm not working in journalism at the moment. That's a very cynical thing for me to say, but I would tell you that many of my colleagues feel the same way. The upside of that is there is a real boon in historical books right now. You have an awful lot of first-class journalists turning to that trade. So I don't know. In terms of what can you do about relying on information, the only other thing to say is, look, there are more outlets for information than ever before. There are more newspapers and magazines in print today than ever in history. There's more access to information. You don't have to read what the New York Times thinks going on in China. You can actually access sources in China on the internet. You know, there is an availability for the informed person who wants to know to find that information as never before. So the inquiring mind can get hold of the information with effort. What we lack today are perhaps the same standards and reliable sources here, and as I said before, I'd like to think that in time that will be corrected. I have faith that, that we will have an improvement, and hopefully soon. Any other questions? Well, thank you for having me. It was a pleasure to be in Montana.